The defensive mastery on display, of course, had to be given an opening. No! I said it at just the wrong moment.
Oh my goodness!
The best chess players in the world gathered in Paris to compete in Freestyle Chess Grand Slam Tour 2025. We started with 12 players, including Magnus Carlsen, two top USA Grandmasters Hikaru Nakamura and Fabiana Caruana, Indian quartet including world champion Gukesh. We had MVL, Rappert, Nepo, Keimer, Abdusadorov. And now we have the finals. And who else? Magnus Carlsen versus Hikaru Nakamura. In soccer terms, El Clásico. Magnus Carlsen starts with white. The pieces are randomly shuffled at the first and eighth rank. And if you watched my yesterday's video, you would notice that yesterday in the semifinals, the queens were also on the squares A1 and A8. And that's the only similarity in the positions. And Carlsen starts with C4, which would be an English opening if this was normal game. And actually, he thought for about 4 minutes on this first move. C5 answers Hikaru. Knight develops to C3, knight C6, knight F3, that's like normal chess. E5. E5, Nakamura played that move to shut down the long diagonal for the queen that is on A1. He wasn't happy really with that move after the game, and as you can see, he spent so much time on it, but he was kind of calculating and planning ahead for the whole game here. Immediate sacrifice of the pawn from Magnus Carlsen, B4. And one of the options was to take the pawn with the pawn, and then after knight D5, knight would be very well placed on a square D5, and according to Nakamura himself, he didn't like that position at all, and that's why he took the pawn with the knight. After he took the pawn with the knight, the pawn on E5 became loose, and Magnus captured it with the knight. Knight takes E5. G6. Interestingly enough, the best move in this position for black was G5, which is not really human move, but this is the move that was the best, and the reason it was the best to in the future to prevent white from ever going to a square H6 with the bishop. Again, G5 was not really a human move in this position. G6 much more logical to open the diagonal for the dark square bishop. Magnus plays D4, immediately striking in the middle of the board, and black castled. I'll show it to you again because it was very subtle move. In Fischer's chess, in freestyle chess, castle is made a little different than in real life, in real chess, I'm sorry. And the main thing is that after the castle, the king is on G8 and the rook is on F8. And that's exactly the same as the castle is done in real chess. So this is the castle. Knight goes to G4. Bishop G7 to somehow protect the square H6 that was becoming very weak. D takes C5 and D5. Nakamura strikes in the middle, and his position is pretty good. Knight H6, which is definitely a move to consider in this position. And now, obviously, black does not want to take it with the bishop, because in those type of positions with those dark squares around the king, you don't want to exchange your dark square bishop, which is really the best piece in your position for black. So king goes to H8 and G4, opening the diagonal for light square bishop for Magnus. Bishop develops to E6, exchange of the pawns on D5, exchange of the minor pieces on D5, and now the bishop on D5 is not under attack because the knight on C3 is pinned to the queen. But bishop goes to B2, and Computer consider this a brilliant move. That's a little bit of exaggeration, of course, because yeah, it's a brilliant move because it's sacrificing the knight on h6. But of course, you cannot take the knight on h6 because you're gonna get bamboozled here with the battery on the long diagonal. After knight takes d5, white is pretty much winning. So after bishop b2, black played bishop e6, offering the exchange of the rooks. But first Carlsen played g5 to support the knight on h6. Although it's on the edge of the board, it serves its purpose. It really limits black ability of moving their king. So that knight on h6 is very unpleasant for Nakamura. Exchange of the rooks on d1 and queen c8, attacking the pawn on c5. Rook g3, ignoring the pawn on c5. Nakamura took the pawn on c5 and it was responded by knight e4. White activates the knight. Now knight in a very good position on e4. Obviously you cannot take the bishop on b2 because the queen is under attack. So the queen has to go somewhere. It went to d5, offering exchange of the queens, and Magnus took the offer, exchanged the queens, and went knight f6. And now both knights are really unpleasant for black. They both limit king's ability to move, and white's position is better, slightly better, but it's very difficult to play for black. Bishop takes a2. That's capturing the pawn, but just for a move, because after rook a3, attacking both the bishop and the pawn, bishop retreats and rook takes a7. So it's again material equality, 4 pawns against 4 pawns. Knight d6 protecting the pawn on b7, f3. Very logical move to limit black's pieces not being able to get to any good squares on e4, g4. And a rook c8, going on an open file, trying to penetrate into white's camp with rook c2. Bishop e5. As we know, Magnus Carlsen is an absolute machine when it comes to the endgames. He might be the best of all time in endgames, but bishop e5 was actually a mistake, and the correct move for white was e4. And the reason that was a correct move, because the pawn on e4 controls all those squares, especially the square on f5. Now, after bishop e5, black were in time to play knight f5, which is a great move. Now they can remove this thorn in their position, the knight on h6. So we have an exchange of the knights on f5, and now Nakamura actually could find a computer move, g takes f5. So computer suggests that it's much better in this position to take the knight with the pawn. Honestly, very difficult to even understand why. So Nakamura played like a human. He took it with the bishop. The engine thinks it's a mistake. Rook takes b7. And now Magnus operates with the extra pawn, which is for him is pretty much winning. Bishop e6, protecting the pawn on f7, and rook goes to b4, transferring the rook through h4, possibly checkmating black king on a square h7, supporting by the knight. Nakamura eliminates that knight right away, and after bishop takes f6, check king g8, we have a position where Magnus has an extra pawn, but we have opposite color square bishops, light square bishop for black and dark square bishop for white, and usually those type of endgames tend to be drawish. So black has all the chances here to survive. King f2, even playing without a pawn and even playing against Magnus. Rook c5, the king marches towards the middle of the board, which should be done in endgames. h6. Nakamura sacrifices the pawn, but it was not necessary at all. I'm not sure why he did that. Magnus just takes the pawn, king h7, and Magnus just protects that pawn with the move bishop g7. And now he has two extra pawns, although those pawns are doubled. g5. Magnus plays e4, and actually that's a mistake, because now the position again is close to equal after the move f5. And Nakamura finds that move, f5, rook b7. So now all type of discovery checks are on the horizon. So f4 check, king f2, rook c2 check, king e1. And here is crucial moment of the game. If Nakamura takes the pawn on h2, this is pretty much a draw. So after the game, believe it or not, Nakamura basically said that he couldn't believe that Magnus left that pawn unattended, and he decided that, well, if Magnus gives you that pawn, something has to be wrong about taking that pawn. With only 5 minutes to go on the clock, Nakamura didn't calculate all the variations. He thought that in some variations his position would not be really great after he takes the pawn, and he decided against taking the pawn on h2, which was the most logical move. Instead, he makes a crucial mistake of the game and plays bishop a2. And that move loses the game on the spot. After bishop f8 check. Nakamura actually resigned, and Magnus, after this game, leads the match 1-0, and the second game would be played tomorrow. Now, why this is lost for black? Let's take a look at some variations. So this is a check, and the king has several squares to go to. Let's start with the square g8. If king g8, then the winning move is h7, king h8, and bishop d6. And black cannot defend from the next move, bishop e5 check, and queening the pawn on h8. Let's take a look at the other variation. If the king goes to h7. If the king goes to h7, one of the variations is bishop g7 check, king g8, and bishop f6. Let's say rook takes h2, rook g7 check, king f8, bishop e7 check, king e8, bishop takes g5, and the next move bishop would take it on and f4, and white would have 3 extra pawns. So not so easy to find all these moves for regular players like us, but for Magnus Carlsen, of course, that was easy, and Nakamura definitely didn't even gave him the benefit of a doubt that he would find all these moves and would easily win the game. The other move that's possible here is king g6. In that case, we have rook g7 check, and after king takes h6, we have a discovery attack, and white wins the rook. But there is a move king f6, and on king f6, actually the best move for white is h4, which is more complicated. The easier way is bishop e7, king e5, bishop takes g5, and again 3 extra pawns for white, and eventually the pawn will march forward and become a queen. So Nakamura didn't want to even test Magnus on all these variations. He resigned in this position after bishop f8 check. Magnus again proved that he is the king, not just of chess, but especially of endgames, leads the match 1-0. Tomorrow is the second game. Thank you for watching.